Let's start with a little quiz question to whet your appetite as we ponder this topic. Here we go. How many verses are there in our modern-day Bible? To make it a little easier, I'll give you three options. Is it 1.1034, 72.196, 46, 3.3, 1102? The correct answer is 31102. Did you get it correct? The precise number can vary a bit, depending on the exact version of the Bible, because different translators sometimes put the verse markers in slightly different places. But it's pretty much 31,100-ish verses. And here's a follow-up question. How many verses were there in the original versions of the Bible? Whether Hebrew, Greek, or Latin texts. And drum roll, please. The answer to that question is 0. Yep, and you read that right. There were no verses, or chapters for that matter, in the original versions of the Bible. And that's something that I find lots of people in church don't realize. So how did it become normal to pick up a Bible and navigate it using the chapter and verse numbers? The concept of dividing the Bible into chapters was first introduced by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, around 1227. Langton's chapter divisions were widely adopted and are still used in most modern Bibles. This innovation made it easier for scholars, clergy, and lay people to locate and reference specific passages. The division of the Bible into verses came later. In 1448, a Jewish rabbi named Nathan divided the Old Testament into verses. This system was primarily used in Hebrew texts and later influenced Christian versions of the Old Testament. For the New Testament, the division into verses was developed by Robert Estienne, also known as Stephanus, in 1551. Estienne was a French printer and scholar who used the verse divisions in his Greek New Testament. His work was quickly adopted and became the standard for subsequent editions of the New Testament. The first Bible to use both chapters and verses was the Geneva Bible, published in 1560. This English translation was produced by Protestant exiles in Geneva during the reign of Queen Mary I of England. The Geneva Bible was notable for its chapter and verse divisions and extensive marginal notes, providing commentary and interpretation of the text. These features made it extremely popular among English-speaking Protestants, and it was the Bible used by many early American settlers. On the positive side, introducing chapters and verses revolutionized how people read and studied the Bible. It allowed for easier cross-referencing, memorization, and systematic study. This structure also facilitated the development of concordances, commentaries, and other study tools that helped to develop biblical scholarship as we understand it today. However, while dividing the Bible into chapters and verses has many benefits, it also has some potential drawbacks. Overdependence on proof texts can lead to reading the Bible in isolated fragments rather than as a continuous narrative. This might cause readers to miss the broader context and flow of the text. In the mid-1990s, I used to frequent Christian forums on the internet. Yeah, there was a time before social media, and sites like Medium forums were a popular way to discuss and debate topics, even if they could end up like the Wild West, with moderators having to ban people regularly. I was a regular on a busy forum based here in the UK, whilst many of us chatted quite openly and even met up in person. There was one particular poster who hid behind a generic username and never revealed anything about himself, or herself, I suppose, although I sensed that he had a Y chromosome. His openly stated mission was to stand up for the Orthodox Christian faith, as he defined it, which meant piling into anything that, in his view, compromised the faith. His bête noire was anything remotely connected to homosexuality, which was a red rag to a bull for him. But his method was relentless and repeated, quoting about 5 or 6 verses from the Bible, the so-called clobber texts. He'd breeze into any thread with the mantra Leviticus 18.2, 2, Leviticus 20.13, Romans 1.2, 6, 27, 1 Corinthians 6.9 to 10, 1 Timothy 1.9 and 10, Jude 1.7. As far as he was concerned, Those verses spoke for themselves and needed nothing other than to be quoted to demolish any other argument. Any attempt to discuss, debate, or refine the argument with context or interpretation was completely ignored. We wouldn't pick up any other book and read it that way. Even a textbook, and the Bible is not meant to be a textbook, wouldn't be read that way. For example, when we grab an encyclopedia to learn about something, we will read a whole article and often then jump to other supporting articles that help to give context, meaning, or depth to our understanding. We do exactly that on Wikipedia without giving it a second thought. Hence, the rapid growth of Wikipedia and other wiki sites has been driven by the provision of extensive hyperlinks. The blue text we click through with abandon. Nobody would ever go to a wiki page, read one sentence, taken completely from its context, and then think they have gained sufficient information to make a considered decision or opinion about any topic. I spotted this just today, and it seemed to me to sum up the problem I am exploring in this post. If you look at the comment thread, you will see that loads of people are firing off proof texts like they are going out of fashion. It's not a discussion or a debate. Nobody is listening, thinking, or considering any opinion other than their own. It's more like Bible boxing. One boxer punches with Romans 8.15, and his opponent counterpunches with John 3.16. Then, the first boxer uppercuts with Galatians 1.7. This is no way to read and apply the Bible. There's no nuance and no thought, simply the repetition of pre-learned texts taken purely in isolation, especially when it's printed on a t-shirt or mug. Some people talk nonsense based on this verse. You get people talking as though we can do anything our hearts desire because, after all, we can do all things through Christ. But when you look at the surrounding verses, that isn't what the Apostle Paul said. Another obvious example of verse filleting is when people rip Jeremiah 29.11 clean out of its context and make it seem like we can all look forward to health, wealth, and prosperity. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. When we examine the surrounding verses, particularly the context of Jeremiah 29, 10, the meaning becomes more specific and less universally applicable. These verses are part of a letter from the prophet Jeremiah to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. They had been taken from Jerusalem and were living in captivity. Jeremiah is telling them that they will remain in exile for 70 years, but after that time, God will fulfill his promise to bring them back to their land. Jeremiah 29:11 reassures the exiled Israelites that God has not abandoned them despite their present-day suffering. He has a plan for the nation of Israel, which includes a future return to their homeland after a long period of hardship. The plans to prosper you in this context are about God's faithfulness to the people of Israel as a whole, rather than a promise of personal prosperity or an easy life for individuals. So while this verse is often used to claim that God has a specific prosperous plan for each person, its actual context is a message of hope and assurance to a people in long-term exile, promising eventual restoration after a period of difficulty. Verses taken out of context can be easily misinterpreted or used to support specific viewpoints without considering the surrounding passages. This can and does lead to misuse of the text. Artificial divisions can disrupt the original literary forms, such as poetry, narrative, and prophecy. This might affect how the text is understood and appreciated. The Bible holds an array of various literary forms, each contributing to its depth and complexity. Here are some of the primary literary forms found in the Bible. 1. Narrative/historical. 2. Law 3. Poetry. 4. Wisdom literature 5. Prophecy 6. Gospel 7. Epistles/teachings 8. Apocalyptic literature 9. Parables 10. Figurative expressions, metaphors, similes, and hyperbole. Understanding these literary forms unlocks a richer, more profound reading of the Bible, revealing its true beauty and depth. The Bible can transform lives. but only when we approach it with the reverence and insight it deserves. It was never meant to be wielded as a weapon, twisting its words to fit our limited, fallible interpretations. While useful, the chapter and verse divisions have often led us astray, reducing this sacred text to a set of fragmented proof texts,